Thank you.
Cool. Thank you very much, Jan. That was very kind. So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. As Jan says, we kind of wanted to bring this session together to talk about how universities and accommodation partners can build better partnerships. First off, before we get into discussion, I wanted to take a moment to let Alan and Robin talk a little bit more about the work they do in their respective organisations. So Alan, if I can hand over to tell us a bit more about the journey that Collegiate's been on in the last couple of years.
Thanks, Deanie, and good afternoon to all. Big thank you for joining the session. So I'm Alan Blackmore, I'm the COO of Collegiate. I've been with Collegiate for just over 6 years now. We've had some big changes in the business over the last 18 months. So I just wanted to take a moment to discuss those. So 18 months ago, Collegiate UK was purchased, the operating platform was purchased by Arlington Advisors. And since then, we've grown our beds under management to 10,500 in the last 18 months. Across 36 properties in 22 UK cities, and the majority of properties we manage now are wholly owned. Collegiate operates 3 brands that cover all aspects of the market and is underpinned by our commitment to student wellbeing and experience. So firstly, University is our affordable offering, which is predominantly ensuite accommodation. Prima Verde is our mid-higher range product offering. That's a mix of both en-suites and studios. They tend to be newer properties with a significant focus on the communal facilities. And then finally, the Collegiate brand, which is a full service model akin to a service department model, which also includes linen, cleaning, and a fully fitted kitchen. So each of the brands that we operate are segmenting the market based on student needs and budgets. Robin, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Alan. Good afternoon, everybody. Robin Walsh. I've been working at Bournemouth University now for 7 years, almost to the day, actually. End of January, I joined 7 years ago. Head of residences here. Before that, I've worked across the sector in different roles. I've worked for University of the Arts London. I've worked for Unite, and I've worked I did a bit of time with Mansion Group, and I've worked for London Metropolitan University. So I've had I've gone back and forth between university and the private sector, but majority of my time has been spent in the university sector. Bournemouth University is a post-92 institution, so we don't own any of our own accommodation. We manage a couple of sites, but they're all of our accommodation portfolio. Our main portfolio for our first years is made up of different private accommodation providers on varying lengths of noms and leases. So it's yeah, I can talk a bit more about that as we go through the session.
Great, thank you, Robin. And I think kind of one of the reasons we wanted to pull this session together, is because I think we all know that having good partnerships with good relationships with your partners is really good business practice. But as the pandemic, inflation, energy rises begin to challenge the sector, and many more other things that are coming our way, at Collegiate, we just wanted to delve a little bit deeper into the goals and objectives of accommodation operators and universities, so that both as a sector and a company, we can build models that deliver that great service to customers, universities, and stakeholders. I think throughout the session, we're probably going to look at kind of 4 key themes. The first being kind of the goals and objectives of universities and operators and where they might align. Understanding of the opportunities of both kind of economic benefits and also those of non-economic benefits. I don't think we often talk about those in terms of how economic and other benefits that a relationship can bring to the sector. We'll also talk about kind of the challenges I'm sure facing the sector over the next 12 months, and also what future might look like. I don't know if we've got a crystal ball to answer that, but I think it would be a good topic of discussion to see what we think it might look like. I'm pretty sure that Robin and Alan will have a very good conversation between them, but we do welcome engagement in this session. So if you've got any questions or comments or want to engage, please put them in the chat, and we will do the best to put that to the group throughout the session or towards the end. So please engage. So without further ado, kind of what are the mutual benefits that universities and operators can align and work on together? Alan, shall I come to you first?
Yeah, I think from an operator perspective, I think there's really are many benefits that can be driven through having real strong relationships with universities. I think firstly, we can be more aligned regarding the student experience and well-being, because both the private sector and universities, we undertake fantastic initiatives in this area. However, sometimes they're not always aligned, and universities are doing one thing, the private sector is doing another. I think by coming together, we can hugely align that. I think an example of this is in some universities, university partners, but not partnerships as such. If we don't have nominations agreements in place, then I found it a challenge at times to get data sharing agreements in place with universities. And therefore, when a student finds himself in times of need and struggling, it's sometimes really difficult to share information across from the private sector with the institutions. I think that's just one way focusing on student well-being, that by having stronger relationships, we can absolutely work closely together for the benefit ultimately of the students. I think the other part, and this is most probably really relevant to the conversation today, is I think we can provide really flexible models to meet your accommodation requirements, because every university has a different requirement, whether that's hard nominations and guaranteeing the beds that universities require, soft nominations where beds can be handed back by a certain point in the calendar, referral schemes where there's no underwrite from any university, but we work really closely in partnership, whereas if we have beds available, then the university can refer students across. And I think, as I say, this has become a much more it's come much more to the forefront with the uncertainty surrounding C19, where people are worried about what hopefully we're out of that now, and the 22-23 cycle will move back to a level of normality, but there are still some uncertainties there, and therefore when you're working in partnership with a university, having that flexibility is really key. And finally, I strongly believe that through the private sector and universities working more closely together, this ultimately improves the student's holistic experience of university, translating into improved overall ratings for the institution. Accommodation, we know, plays a huge part in the overall student satisfaction numbers, and there's sort of some really strong operators focused on student well-being with excellent accommodation out there that can really help institutions overall goals. Robin, do you have some further thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that you say there. There's a lot of there's a lot there to kind of unpick, and I guess it's about really, I'm not claiming to speak for all universities, by the way, with everything that I'm saying today. And I know I can see, we've got some colleagues from different universities who are in attendance here, so it'll be interesting to hear their viewpoints on this. But I mean, the three main things that I sort of pulled out, sort of headlines, I think universities do want is we want to be able to recruit and house our target numbers. We want to have a range of price points and different types of accommodation available, but all at a good standard. And then the final point is around having healthy and engaged students. So they were the sort of the three things that I sort of pulled out as sort of headlines, and I think that it sounds like it's sort of broadly that sort of chimes with what you said as well there, Alan. I guess really, you know, what are our, is it relevant what our priorities are, so long as we can achieve all of those together? Because, you know, I'm sure from the private sector, you know, you've got to achieve a certain level of income. Otherwise, you're just not going to be there to offer the beds. And I guess, you know, when you think about that from a university's point of view, you know, it's quite easy to sort of sit from a university's point of view, well, that's your problem, you know, private provider. You've got the marketing expertise, you've got the sales, go out there and do it. But if you guys aren't there, then actually a lot of universities are going to really struggle to have the bed spaces in order to be able to house those students that they're recruiting. So, you know, there's you know, we might see it through a slightly different lens, but it's the same thing, isn't it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think if universities and the private sector come together more strategically, there's so many benefits we can deliver. Ultimately, the PBSA sector has, in many markets, allowed the growth of student numbers for universities by being able to house them. So without the private sector, that would have been a challenge for universities. But I still think there's more benefits of working closer together. The benefits of a nominations agreement for the private provider is it drives out quite a bit of cost. Yep. So the cost of acquisition on a direct let building, the marketing, the fact that if you don't have nomination agreements with universities, councils are chasing you for council tax left, right and centre, whereas with an agreement with the university, you can be excluded from council tax. So that there's a lot of wastage from the private operators by not having agreements in place. And ultimately, I can certainly speak from my perspective, is these buildings have a net operating income that they need to deliver. If we can drive out cost in delivering that overall NOI, then we can pass that directly back to the people that really matter, the students. But with more and more costs being enforced on PBSA, we all know what's happening with utilities. We have council tax because local councils are cash strapped, so they're becoming more aggressive. Local councils are bringing in selective licensing schemes, whereas you're having to pay for additional licensing on top of what we've ever had to do previously. So when you start building all that together, then that ultimately is driving rents up. Whereas by working together with universities, a lot of those costs can be circumnavigated by having agreements in place.
Yeah. I think also, just purely looking at it from Bournemouth point of view, actually, there's a limit of what universities can commit themselves to, because they can't just take on all of the private beds in their town or city and then commit to filling those anywhere between sort of 95 and 100% occupancy. The universities just aren't going to sort of willing to have that sort of level of commitment and risk. But having the beds that you require strategically as a university to meet your guarantee, that's the main driver, to have enough beds to meet your guarantee, and not have too many voids outside of that. But if like Bournemouth, you are essentially reliant on the private sector to be able to house your students, actually having agreements in place that benefit both parties for the reason you say, Alan, where you can sort of drive down the costs and the headline rental price. But having that nomination agreement in place can also as well cement the annual uplifts. So for example, again, I'm going to draw a few stats from the accommodation cost survey, just because it's the latest data we've got. is that, looking back over the average uplifts across the sort of the private PBSA sector, 2018-19, on average, is a 6.3% uplift in rents. 2021-22, there's a 4.3% uplift, and we know that they're RPI busting uplifts. RPI was certainly nowhere near those figures back then. I mean, look at it now, it's a bit scary, but by us having sort of formal agreements in place, the uplifts in the private PBSA that we've got nominations agreements in place was a third of those figures. So actually having those agreements in place can be ultimately to the benefit of the students when times are sort of tough, and having those caps and collars in place as part of those agreements. Yep. So that's something that you can do, I think, sort of together for mutual benefit. But outside of that, I think also as well, there are things that you can do as a university whereby you're not taking on those formal nominations agreements. And you mentioned it as well, Alan, around sort of using those sort of more loose nominations, what people refer to maybe as referral agreements, where you don't actually take on any financial risk. But what you do is that you look to utilise the good quality private PBSA operators in your town and city. And what we're doing here in Bournemouth, as an example, is that we are promoting the private sector. We've got certain standards in place. We expect certain things to be in place. ANOC accreditation is an absolute benchmark. That's the starting point. And then what we do is, we drive our current students, our returning students, into those buildings, and it's a win-win then, because again, you guys can offer us sort of favourable rates on those referral agreements because you're not spending so much on marketing. You're getting, if it works, you get those private PBSA buildings kind of full before early summer, and then depending on the market, it's different in different towns and cities. But if there's an issue kind of with oversupply, what you don't want as a university, what you don't want to happen is for there to be lots of private PBSA operators going after your first years and marketing, through UCAS and through Google, and basically, diverting our first years away from the university portfolio that we need to fill. So,
I think there's a really good couple of points that you made there, Robin. First one on inflation. We're looking at potentially going north of 7% inflation this year, and private providers who are not in nominations may be moving close to those levels of increases to cover the costs. In a nominations agreement, then it's cap and collared, as you say. So you're protecting the university and students from any abnormal growths in inflation. I think secondly is when I speak with universities, some of the real concerns that I hear is they believe that the private sector is in absolute direct competition for their first year students. I don't believe this to be the case, because as the landscape's changed, universities are providing accommodation guarantees for first year students pretty much regardless of when or where they've come through the application process. In the past, there was obviously a cut-off day if it was the first choice university, not providing accommodation for first years coming through clearing. Well, as it's become a more competitive landscape, I've seen that erode over the years. So therefore, whilst we do house some first year students on a direct basis, I really believe that the universities, either through their own stock or beds they've secured with the private providers, are pretty much providing for this cohort. For the most part anyway. Yes, we do get some direct let students coming, international maybe coming through, but from my perspective, I just want full buildings. I don't, so either through nominations, referrals, partnerships with universities to deal with your first years. But what I find really interesting is that most institutions don't provide for returning students, both undergrad and postgrad. And I think these students would still greatly benefit from the offering that the PBSA sector provides. I think traditionally, maybe, it's only my thought, that universities have not considered being able to provide it to returners. because there wasn't the availability of those quality beds in the marketplace, which in most cities there are now. So by coming together and working with you on your first year students, or the opportunity for us to work in partnership to promote the multiple benefits of returning students to PBSA, I think that could be hugely beneficial. Because it's not only the first year students that find themselves in challenging situations and therefore could benefit from this increased level of pastoral care that the PBSA sector provides. And I think ultimately housing all years of students in PBSA would improve overall student satisfaction, and the university's overall students' university experience overall.
Yeah, I think going back to the local situation, I think that's the key. Because every town and city is different. I mean, there will be some places where the kind of supply and demand is about right, and everybody gets enough students coming through the door to fill their beds. And then there are going to be other places where there is going to be an oversupply. And that will balance out over time, but until that balances out, then people will that can, I think, when we're talking about kind of partnerships, when the economic sort of situation is difficult, it's potentially more it's more challenging to have a close relationship, because your conversations are always going to be tainted by the financial impact if there's a chance of kind of anyone having under occupancy, then the competition is going to be there. It's always going to be there.
I think you're absolutely right. But if you look at high level students, I'm not discounting the rite of passage to go and live in HMO, and that's something that maybe working together, we can improve students' thoughts of having to move into the HMO market. But in most cities, when you look at the high level student numbers, then if second and third years weren't all heading off into the HMO market and taking up valuable housing stock, and not being provided for or their well-being taken as seriously within PBSA, then the high level numbers do account for the majority of PBSA stock available. And that's why investors are still investing in this sector, because they look at high level student numbers and the ability or the availability of beds, the ratio of students to PBSA beds. So they are there. It's how do we help students make the decision that maybe the PBSA sector, they're best placed, and how do we promote that collectively?
That's right, and that is about having those kind of those partnerships in the way that you promote, in order to offer choice exactly for those. And looking at somewhere like Bournemouth, there's an Article 4 directive in place. The local council is actively wanting to sort of increase the HMO sector for families and for young professionals. And there are areas, and it's similar to like most university towns and cities, where there is a sort of an oversaturation of student properties, and that comes with challenges to the wider community, and broader housing demand. So the private PBSA sector is absolutely sort of one of the main sort of drivers to get students to move out of that. And what we've seen is that as more private beds have gone up in Bournemouth over the last few years, and students, and through us working together with the private providers, through the referral agreements, us actively promoting that, students will ultimately choose. We're not forcing students to go into the private sector, PBSA. What happens with a lot of them is that they will go and have that rite of passage. They'll go into the HMO sector, and then for the third year, where they want a little bit more security and just be able to concentrate on their studies, then a lot of them will choose then to go into sort of private PBSA. And also the other thing that as well, that what we've noticed is we've got a student lettings service, which is where we advertise the private referral beds. But that traditionally has been basically a student lettings agency. So we work with local small landlords on sort of 4, 5, 6 bed HMO houses, and we advertise those. What we found is that since there's been an influx of private PBSA beds, actually there's actual competition now for those smaller landlords. And what we've seen is that there used to be a situation in Bournemouth where students didn't have any choice. They had to go out into the HMO sector, and landlords could basically, charge what they wanted. They never had to do any sort of maintenance really. There was some real dumps out there. We knew of some pretty dodgy landlords who were getting away with murder. And we've seen those landlords because we know they come straight to us when they've not filled their house, saying where the students gone, what's happened? Are you like not taking on any are you taking on less students? We say, well, no, our student numbers are fine. It's competition. Have you not been down into Bournemouth and seen all these new buildings going up? That's your competition now. So we've seen some landlords of the dodgier ones falling out of the market, and other landlords, they're actually starting to spend a bit of money now on their properties and be a little bit more professional and serious about standards in their properties, because they just can't get away with slapping a bit of cheap paint on each year. So it has looking more widely around sort of how private PBSA can come and affect positively the market. That's another element that we've seen here in Bournemouth. And it makes sense to not just let these things happen organically, but try and work together to, as you say, to mutual benefit and for the good of the, ultimately for the students, And
I think that was something that I was picking up on, is that ultimately, are we having enough conversations at that level? Because what we're saying is that second and third years might want to go for that rite of passage to HMO, but PBSA is building buildings, but are we having those conversations with students and universities to understand what those buildings should look like?
I think you're absolutely right. I've been in situations in the past whereby I've had multiple properties within a city, with one of them being on nominations, but not having that, struggling to get that partnership approach where we could market to those first years to move across into another building within its second year. But worse than that, some students wanting to stay requesting to stay in the property, but because it was only for first years, then you couldn't house them there. So I think there is a need for some returners. I don't think we get over the rite of passage completely. I genuinely don't. But I think we can influence it collectively, for the benefit of all.
I think there's another. Oh, sorry, go on. No, go, Robbie.
No, Dean, I was going to pick up on your point you said earlier about having those conversations, and I think I would strongly encourage people to have those conversations and to try and reach out and find the right people to speak to internally, because sometimes sometimes within universities, I think student accommodation can. I think it's changed a lot, but it used to be, it used to be kind of, the office tucked away at the back of the, the estates team or something. But I think that has changed dramatically over the years. But I think, unfortunately, in some universities, there's still that lack of awareness of how important student accommodation is, just internally. Whereas, again, one of the things that drew me here to Bournemouth was that they'd moved the student accommodation team from estates over into student services. Because they really saw, that, of course, it's about bricks and mortar and about getting things right, and safe and, and good quality and all that. But actually, when you get all that stuff right, it's about a student service, and you're delivering a really important student service there. And it's about well-being. We'll talk a little bit more about well-being in a second, I think. But picking up on your point, Deanie, about having those conversations to try and influence and input into what beds look like, what these new buildings look like, and that's a real challenge, actually. And there's a couple of things I think that, from a university's point of view, that I want to make here is that I think, I think operators will want. They will be supportive of having, different styles, a different mix. But I think that the crunch comes to when it's what's going to get the investment. And what's going to get the investment is going to be your, it's the meat and two veg, isn't it? It's your 6 to 8 bed clusters with a smattering of studios, and that, with now you might have maybe, you know, 2 communal spaces in a building, you know, rather than just one old common room. You know, you might have an open plan reception instead of the hatch in the wall. But there is a danger that there's still a bit meat and 2 veg thinking when it comes to putting buildings in place, because that's what investors see as a safe bet for their money. Whereas I think what universities would like to see, and I think students, you know, would like to see, is a bit more of a range. And this goes back to having sort of a range of types of accommodation and price points, and the big word of affordability. You know, because you know, what is affordability? And I think, again, this came out quite strongly with the accommodation cost survey around defining affordability. And there is only one sort of widely known used model, and it's the NUS model, which, if anyone who knows, it's you know, outside of London, basically the NUS model says that 25% of all beds need to be at 50% or less of the maximum student loan. Maximum student loan this year is £9,488. That means an affordable bed's going to be 4,700 quid. You know, how can you build a new bed for 4,700 pounds to sell it at 4,700 pounds? You know, all the marketing savings in the world are not going to give you a bed that you can sell at 4,700 pounds. I can see Alan nodding there. And you know, and then from a student's point of view, paying that, you know, again, drawing on the accommodation cost survey, you're looking at the average rent, the university average rent, £6,200. You know, that's 70%. Sorry, the maximum loan, the average loan that people would get, based on an average UK household income of £29,000. A student's going to be looking at getting not the maximum loan, but more like 8,800 quid instead of 9,500 quid. You know, with average uni rents of 6,200, that's 70%. Even the university rents, which are the lower end of the spectrum, that's still 70% of students' income. You know, in the private PBSA sector, you're looking more like 83% of the average student loan. So, you know, these are huge points, and how do you address these points moving forward? To find what, you know, and this is affordability with a broad brush, because, you know, when we're talking about student loans, we're talking about average UK students, and we know that you know that there are many different types of students. You've got your average, and then you've got all the other types. Yeah. You know, you've got students who have got a brother or sister who's also in university at the same time. You know, you've got international students. You've got, you know, postgraduate students. You know, there are lots of different types of students. So what is affordability? How can we get a model of affordability, or different models of affordability, that actually make sense? Alan, kind of ranted there a bit. What?
You know, I think that affordability is a very broad brush statement, because what's affordable to me is not necessarily affordable to somebody else, and it's all on personal circumstances, albeit there may be categories of affordability given. But I do think that there's ways of people of the sector working together to look at things, to rip up the way we've always done things and look at it differently. So when I talk about the cost savings that could be delivered through working together, and some of them are sizable, especially depending on the amount of beds you're working with an institution. There may be a way of substituting rents from people from lower social backgrounds, whereas international students, the fees would be the same, and no different than maybe international students. The fees they pay for tuition for their education is higher than that they pay than a domestic student pays within the UK. So it may be that the savings, the university have the ability to issue those savings based on criteria of a particular student. Because, as I say, I know that some international students that come to live with us, they don't ask about a product range, they ask what's the most expensive, and that's affordable to those students. So I think it opens a real interesting conversation on how can you support. Maybe you do have 20% of your rooms in a building with your partners on a lower rent because you can fund that through the savings in your OPEX that are being delivered.
Yeah, I think it's something that I think the private sector needs to kind of really think about, actually, get an understanding of what can be done differently. And people talk about it. I hear a lot of people talking about doing things differently, and and going on conferences, to going around Europe, to seeing all different models of different types of student accommodation, and sustainability. We've not talked about sustainability, have we? But what I don't see is anyone genuinely sort of doing the groundwork to do something different. I mean, is there anyone out there who is genuinely sort of building something right now that is vastly different and is trying to break the mold?
I'm hoping this is the start of a conversation to start thinking slightly differently, collectively, because the answer is no. And if we sit here without looking at different ways of delivering, then I don't know how it can't all fall on the private sector to deliver an affordable product, because inflation going to hit over 7%, bill costs or labor costs or etc., additional costs being piled onto us by local governments. We're not going to be able to do this on our own, by it all falling back onto the private sector. But I do genuinely believe that in partnership we can drive out waste. And that's the bit that frustrates me in business. Costs are costs. Ultimately, to operate a business, any business, you're going to incur costs. What you don't want to incur is waste. And I think currently across the sector, we are wasting money that could either fund better initiative programs, help to structure more affordable rents going forward. But we can't do that without partnership. Just as I say, just council tax alone, if you can't get exemption from council tax, and that's costing you, when you have an empty room, £1,200 to £1,500 a year, straight off your bottom line. Whereas with a university agreement, many councils will provide you an exemption where you're not having those costs. Then there's a lot of waste out there. Well, we can't control inflation, but we can control wastage that's not helping anybody on this call.
Yeah.
Is there a wider conversation there, which I think we've hit on already, but there is the council here that's part of this circular, and I know of a council that is trying to kind of answer this, but both the affordability, but get students out of HMO and how they can engage with universities and PBSA to do that. And I think is it not just universities and PBSA that need to work together, but actually there's a third partner there that needs to come to the table?
I think you're right, Dean. I think there's I mean, it's even wider again, isn't it? I mean, looking at sort of different models of providing housing. I mean, there's sort of the charity sort of model. You could. I'm sure there's something, I don't know enough about it myself, but I've heard people talk about there's different sort of financing models that aren't so heavily driven by the need to create a high return. I think that there's a place there, isn't there? But it's just I mean, Unipol is the only organisation in the UK that I'm aware of who is sort of in that sort of ballpark. There might be some smaller operators. I think that there's one in London. I can't remember the name of them, based in sort of West London. I can't remember the name of them. They're a charity providing student accommodation. I mean, the quality wasn't great, but it was cheap for London. Oh, of course, you've got Cass and Claredale, of course. Cass and Claredale in East London. And they're doing some great work around sort of keeping rents low, but offering good affordable accommodation. So I think there's different models that could be explored and sort of broadened out on a wider basis. That's an interesting.
And just to talk a little bit more about kind of, obviously there's the economic benefits and affordability issue, but what is there that kind of that we should, I think one of the things that struck me, and obviously I'm a marketeer, but we do have a shared customer. So what are those softer things that actually we should be working on and should be developing that benefits both universities and PBSA, because we all want a happy customer at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think that's the sort of, I'm just thinking, like, we talked about the three things that I sort of identified myself, and so we've talked about kind of, providing enough beds, talked about sort of price, talked about sort of quality and range. I think the one really important sort of area, which, save the best till last, it's around student levels of well-being, because, if you've got happy, healthy students, they're more likely to be engaged with their academic studies, and ultimately around sort of, performing the best that they can and staying at university. And that obviously is what universities want, and it's what private providers want, because they don't want them dropping out of their bookings. And I think that just sort of, looking at the private sector, 70, again, accommodation cost survey stats, 76% of PBSA's of PBSA beds now sit within the private sector, compared to 39% back in 2012-13. So, the private, it's here to stay, and it's growing, and so more and more students are going to be living in it, and therefore it's important that we get that model of how we support their well-being right. And drawing on again, just my experiences here in Bournemouth, something that we've done is that we work with our private accommodation partners to sort of put on a residential life program across all of their buildings. So we've got our immediate portfolio for our first years, and that's the portfolio I'm talking about, where we've got a residential life program that we've been running now. This is the 5th year, and it's a partnership arrangement with the different providers who help to sort of finance it. It's delivered by the university, but again, say in partnership. Now, what's really interesting is, and this is hot off the press, I've literally just closed the survey and I've just been crunching the numbers through. We just surveyed the students about their experiences of the residential life program in term 1. And one of the questions that we asked the students who had engaged with our Res Life Wellbeing service, we targeted them and we asked them specifically that, before they spoke to the wellbeing team, were they considering dropping out of Bournemouth University? And 38% of them said that they were considering dropping out of the university. And then we asked them the question of, now you have spoken with the wellbeing coordinator and then been passed on to other wellbeing services, are you now, what's the likelihood of you dropping out of the university? 88% said that it was either unlikely or very unlikely that they would now drop out of university. So, and that's a program that we do in partnership with our accommodation providers. And then another really powerful statistic, again, that I just pulled out, is that all of our students, regardless of, so not just the ones who have engaged with the wellbeing service, all of our students in our private providers buildings, we asked them whether they had experienced certain types of sort of wellbeing issues, one being an experience of loneliness. Those students who didn't engage with the Res Life program. And what I mean by that is that they've never been to any of the activities, and they also say that they don't know how to access wellbeing support in their accommodation. So they're not engaged. We call them not engaged. 32% of them said that they experience loneliness a lot or often. And then when you look at the students who engaged with the residential life program, so that they've been to the activities and they know how to access welfare support, it's only 16%. So it halves those people who say that they've experienced loneliness a lot or often. So, there's a huge correlation there, and that's only possible when you've got a strong partnership in place, you see. And that's something that, people here may have heard me talk passionately about before, but, it's something that I think is really possible. It's very, it's an easy conversation to start having with the providers. The hard work is actually making that work, and keep it developing. That's where the real hard work comes in, is maintaining that collaborative approach. But the rewards are there, as I said, some of those stats I've just told you.
Rob and I absolutely agree with that. And just taking it one step further, is students are not interested, not concerned what commercial arrangements the private sector has with the university, ultimately that they will be and always are students of the university who happen to be our tenants. So how do we work closer together, whether or not we have a commercial agreement in place, to ensure that students that may have had to or have chosen to go into the private sector, where there isn't a commercial relationship in place, don't feel like maybe second-class citizens of the university because they didn't end up in a property where a residential life program was in place. And how do we work closer together to make sure all students of the universities, regardless of those commercial arrangements, actually get the same level of service?
Yeah,
I think that's an interesting point.
Yeah, and it is hard work, it is hard work, but it is about just reaching out and having those conversations, isn't it? Pick up the phone, walk into a building, send an email, and just say, I'm interested in talking to you about how we support our students mutually together, to the benefit of them. I don't think, we have data sharing agreements in place with our immediate accommodation partners. We don't have data sharing agreements in place with the wider DL providers in Bournemouth. However, we're in just in the early stages of drawing up a protocol, because data sharing, people get very scared about data sharing, don't they? But actually, you can share data, you can share student information. It's just about the teams on the ground knowing, under what circumstances. I think, the ICO have already got a code of practice that actually sets out how you can share data in a fair and proportionate way that's in line with data protection legislation. So it's already there, but it's just about, sometimes the more senior leaders and managers of organizations need to actually step in and help the people who are at the coalface or on the ground at reception, the managers of the buildings, helping them to understand that, if you've got a student in your building and you don't have any direct relationship with the university, but actually you've got a real concern about their behavior, then actually you can share that information with the institution. And the institution should be stepping up and helping them to support that student, in my view.
That's great. I'm conscious of time, so I think what would be good just to hear from you both, kind of what you think future partnerships might look like, or what you'd like future partnerships to look like in the future, knowing the challenges that we've discussed that upon the sector, really.
I suppose from my perspective, regardless, as I said, of the commercial positions, that we work much closer together. And I know my team and I are really open to putting those or to creating those partnerships, deeper partnerships. I think one of the things that I would like to see going forward is, as I said earlier, I hate waste. I hate waste, and I can see that there's multi-million pounds worth of waste across the whole sector, right? Whereby if we work closer and smarter together, then we can drive that out ultimately for the benefit of students. And then finally, we can provide flexible models, ultimately working together for the benefit of students. As I said right at the beginning of this, I don't think there's enough collaboration to have more second and third year students living in PBSA who would benefit from all the initiatives around experience and well-being. It's, as I say, when they get past it, you don't only have mental health issues or challenges within your first year. And then ultimately, I think from a corporate social responsibility point of view, working together to have more second and third years living within PBSA sector and opening up the housing stock to starter family homes would be a really great thing for us to deliver back to our local communities. So that's how I would like to see future agreements. moving. But equally, we're completely open to, every university has slightly different ambitions and goals, and we need, as a sector, we need to be open to listening to what the requirements of the institutions are and how we can best work together.
That's great. And Robin?
Yeah, I think just that last point is a really important point that Alan's made. I think each town and city is going to have its own unique kind of variance around what the priorities are, what the pressures are. But I think it needs to start with a conversation, and I think that the conversation needs to be at all levels, but it really does need to come from people who have got the ability to make the change and drive that change in culture of being more collaborative, and let's not just say it and talk about it in round tables like this. Let's actually go away and do something. Let's go away and sort of pick up, find out, contact the local PBSA provider or contact the local institution and find out who is it that actually you can have a meaningful conversation with, and make sure that meaningful conversation doesn't just stay in a room or just in a Zoom meeting, that actually those people then walk away from that and take that, and engage the rest of the team and bring the rest of the team along. That's how it's got to start. What it turns into will be different for each individual town and city.
No, yeah, totally agree. I think, that let's make change, it can only be done if it is actual change and it's not just spoken about. So I think that's a good point for us to think on as we all move away. Alan, well, thank you both. I really enjoyed that conversation. It was great. And I know we didn't get any questions to the audience, but I know Vicky has said that that they're at a point of looking at their residencies and developing them, and has found the session useful around kind of speaking and reaching out, like you said, Robin, to a PBSA and just having that conversation. Alan, is it okay if I just come to you to just close a bit with kind of collegiate, and then we'll pass over back to Jan?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Deanie. So thanks everybody for the time. I was mindful that we only had an hour today, and there's so much more that me and Robin could have spoke about. If anybody would like to have a further conversation, a more in-depth conversation that's aligned to their institution, then post a meeting. My details will be getting shared with anybody. And I'd really welcome the opportunity to continue to have these conversations. I'm passionate about how the private sector and HE and institutions can work closer together to ultimately deliver benefit for all parties. So if anybody would like to continue that conversation, then please do feel free to drop me a note, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Jan?
Yeah, well, I'd like to say huge thank you to Alan at Collegiate, and also to Robin for what I think was a really interesting and open discussion about many of the issues that we're facing in the accommodation sector, and how to develop really positive partnerships that can potentially help all students and help all universities. I think, that starting a conversation was often said, and you talked also about making sure that the right people are in that conversation. So I'd like to really encourage everybody to, when we share this recording with you, to share it around your university as well with your colleagues, so that more people can hear the discussion that's just taken place, and some of the ideas that have come from it, and some of the pleas for change and action. So all in all, I think a really, really interesting debate. Thank you all. I was really delighted to see that people stayed on the call throughout, which speaks to how useful and interesting this conversation has been. And we'll be in touch. So thank you again to everybody. We will share the discussion recording with you in the next couple of days. And as Alan said, if you'd like to talk to Collegiate directly, please do get in touch. We'll share Alan's details with you as well. So thank you all. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.